We've heard so many things over the years, over the nearly 3 years now, the Russia-Ukraine war, about red lines, and allegedly Russia crosses them, or we crossed them and nothing happens. Are the red lines real? Are they not? Well, Vladimir Putin came out in a speech earlier today where he said that the only thing about red lines are that we're trying to push Russia across their red lines, and wanting to see what's going to happen. And he was a little confused and unclear about why that was, but he seems to be pretty certain that there are red lines, and if we push hard enough, we're going to find out where they are. Now, we have to examine, especially this late in the game, when the war is effectively already over, and we're literally in the final act of it now, and waiting for the end game to play out once Trump is inaugurated. That's been very clear. Why would we want to find out in this 11th hour where the red lines are for Russia, and what would be the consequences if we succeed? To try and untangle some of this, we have one of the best commentators are in the United States and really in the world, and that is our good friend, Professor John Mearsheimer, who is the international relations theorist and professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Professor, welcome back, as always, to the show.
Thank you, Danny. Glad to be here.
Well, let's just delve right into this. Why do we want to continue pushing Russia up until to find out, are these long-range missiles really a red line, or are they not a red line? What's the benefit to the United States or the West and NATO at this late hour?
Well, I don't think that the Biden administration, which of course is driving this train, is interested in testing red lines or testing Putin. I think what the Biden administration is interested in doing is everything possible to make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose on the battlefield, doesn't collapse before January 20th, number one. And number two, I think the Biden administration wants to be able to say after January 20th that it did everything possible to help Ukraine, and that by allowing Ukraine to use these long-range missiles, these ATACMS missiles, to hit Mother Russia, they can say, they meaning the Biden administration, after they leave office, that they gave Ukraine everything they wanted. So I think that's really what's going on here, because I think in no meaningful way is using ATACMS going to cause the Russians to really up the ante, especially to go nuclear. They don't have to do that. They'll respond. They responded the first time with the Orezhnik missile. The second time they responded by a massive strike against the electricity grid in Ukraine. So the Russians will respond, but the Russians have no interest in letting this conflict escalate out of control, because, as you said, they're on the verge of victory. Why spoil that by allowing the war to escalate?
And it's Putin himself, and we actually have a clip from the interview or the speech that he made, from which that headline was drawn, and he seems a bit bemused as to why we want to even keep going down the road. And he had an interesting analogy that we've used a version of before, which I found very interesting.
They try to keep their population in fear of a Russian attack. Their tactics are very simple. They push us to the red line. They push us to the boundary, forcing us to respond, and then they start presenting us as a threat, just as they did during the Soviet times.
And now I've certainly seen that where it's happened, because every time Russia responds to these kinds of attacks, especially this one you mentioned a minute ago, which was, at least according to the reports, 93 missiles of various types and 200 long-range drones that were used, and it caused enormous damage again. But then that's always characterized as, see, Russia is terrorizing the civilian population as they respond to that. How do you see that dynamic playing out? And is that working, that claim?
Well, Danny, this line of argument has been present long before the ATACMS were an issue. We have been arguing, we meaning the West, that the Russians are bent on conquering Eastern Europe, if not all of Europe, that Putin is highly aggressive, and so forth and so on. So there's nothing new here, in my opinion. What's going on is it's quite clear that Ukraine is going to lose, as you said. And furthermore, President Trump has made it clear that once he re-enters the White House, He's in effect going to try to pull the plug on the Ukrainians. And what's going on is that the Biden administration and people in the West more generally are trying to do everything they can to portray Russia as the second coming of the Third Reich so that we don't abandon Ukraine, so that this doesn't look like Munich II. So that's really what's going on. And I don't think it has that much to do with the whole ATACMS issue.
Well, and that's a perfect segue into the next thing I want to discuss about, because over the weekend, Fareed Zakaria went on his show to explain what this is really all about, that this is to try and prevent Russia. And he provided what he claimed was some evidence to support this, that they're just going to keep on going if they win. Watch this.
Trump also said that he knew Vladimir well. Then he surely knows that on this issue, the chief challenge that he will face once back in the White House is getting Vladimir to abandon his dream of reconstructing Russia's Tsarist empire. Putin has pursued that vision since his first days in office, launching a savage war in Chechnya soon after coming to power, invading Georgia in 2008, annexing Crimea in 2014, and attempting to conquer all of Ukraine in 2022. If Trump can convince Vladimir, his friend, of that, he will be able to do what he has always said was his goal: end the war in Ukraine.
So let's look at that list that he mentioned there, because Zakaria said that as evidence of that Putin wanted to recreate not the USSR but Tsarist empire. He said that he attacked into Chechnya, into Georgia, into Crimea, and then now into Ukraine, as though there was no reason for any of those. He just wants to conquer. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that these claims are just nonsense. I mean, first of all, with regard to Chechnya, that was an internal Russian problem. There was an insurrection in Chechnya, and the Russians dealt with it, but it had nothing to do with recreating the Russian Empire. With regard to both Georgia and Ukraine, whether you're talking about what happened regarding Crimea in 2014, or whether you're talking about the war in Ukraine that started 8 years later in 2022, those conflicts were all about NATO expansion. They had nothing to do with Putin being interested in recreating the Russian Empire. Putin has never indicated that he had any interest in recreating the Russian Empire. And furthermore, he has made it manifestly clear with regard to both Georgia and Ukraine that this was all about NATO expansion. And with regard to Ukraine more generally, it was all about the West's effort to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. From his point of view, this was unacceptable. And with regard to Zakaria's point that Putin is bent on conquering all of Ukraine, there has never been any evidence that he was interested in doing that. And in fact, he does not have the military capability to do that. As I like to say, when the Germans conquered the western one half of Poland and incorporated it into the Third Reich, they were conquering a piece of territory that is much, and I underline the word much, smaller than Ukraine is. And the Wehrmacht went into Poland, into Western Poland, with 1.5 billion men. Putin went into Ukraine with at the very most 190,000 troops. He wasn't going to conquer all of Ukraine with an army that small. And furthermore, immediately after the Russian army entered Ukraine, Putin put out peace feelers to the Ukrainians, which is what led to the Istanbul negotiations. Nobody puts out peace feelers that lead to negotiations in Istanbul if he is interested in conquering all of Ukraine. This is a fairy tale that we hear over and over and over, and it's all designed to make it look like Putin is principally responsible for this disaster in Ukraine, and that if we abandon Ukraine or we lose to Ukraine at this point in time, it will be the end of the world. And therefore, we have to stay in the fight and double down.
And certainly that's the result for the Ukrainian side. And Volodymyr Zelensky has never been anything but a full supporter of that idea. But you have to get to the point, or you meaning the West, at some point our leaders have to come to the point to where we say, yeah, it would be cool to do that, to have that outcome that we want, that Putin's not going to win, et cetera. But to continue going down that path of verbally and setting up this narrative that the ground won't support and that Russia is continuing to win, it's going to come to some kind of an ugly crash at some point, does it? Because you can't maintain the fiction forever.
Yeah, but 2 quick points, Danny. One is you want to be careful that you don't wish for a Russian defeat. You say it would be a good thing if that could possibly happen. If the Russians were to lose the war in Ukraine, I think there is a very good chance that they would use nuclear weapons. You want to remember the Russians view what's going on in Ukraine as an existential threat. And if the Russians were losing in Ukraine, and if the sanctions were working, and it looked like Russia was going to be knocked out of the ranks of the great powers, I think the Russians would probably turn to nuclear weapons. With regard to my second point, I would agree with you completely. It's time to realize that we've lost this one, we meaning the West, and that the best thing we could do, especially for Ukraine, is put an end to this conflict. You and I, of course, have argued this for a long time. This was the argument that you and I made jointly at the Council on Foreign Relations earlier this year. But nobody listens to us because so many people are committed to staying in this fight because they have this illusion that Ukraine can win, that it can stymie the Russians on the battlefield, turn the tide, get back its territory, and so forth and so on. This is delusional, but it doesn't appear to be the case that all of the key people in the foreign policy establishment in the United States buy this argument. I'm sure a few of them do at this point. I imagine that Trump, J.D. Vance, and a handful of other people in the new administration buy this argument. But when you look at the lineup of people that Trump is bringing in with him, there are a lot of super hawks in this new incoming administration.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with the seeming, I don't know if it's contradiction, but certainly diversity of views on this topic, I guess we should say. Interesting, you touched on the nuclear issue there in your first comment, your first point there you just made. And it's interesting because a lot of the people in the West, in fact, I saw one on a European channel yesterday, I suppose it was, where they're saying, listen, the fact that Putin keeps talking about nuclear weapons and changing his nuclear dynamics or his enforcement mechanisms, et cetera, that's because they're so weak and they know that they have to have that ready to avoid a defeat. But earlier today, Putin had a different take on that.
The share of state-of-the-art military equipment in nuclear forces is now 95%, and the basic principles governing the use of such weapons have been updated, as outlined in the updated state nuclear deterrence policy. And once again, so that no one accuses us of nuclear saber-rattling, it is a deterrence policy.
So who's just making things up here? Is Putin just saying this to cover over his weakness, or are the Europeans making this comment that they're saying just to cover over our weakness?
Look, it's very clear that it's Ukraine that is weak and Russia that is strong. General Cavoli, who is the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, has made it very clear that the Russian military today is a much more formidable fighting force than it was in 2022 when the war broke out. And almost everybody recognizes that Ukraine is in a much weaker position today than it was in 2022. The balance of power in 2022 favored Ukraine. Ukraine did very well in 2022. That world has gone away. In 2024, and in December 2024 in particular, the balance of power has shifted in significant ways in Ukraine's disadvantage, and they're going to lose the war. Exactly what the defeat looks like is difficult to say. I believe the Russians will win an ugly victory, but they're going to win anyway. And the Russians are not weak. It's the Ukrainians who are weak. And all of this talk in the West about a weak Russia and the idea that we now have them on the ropes, and if Trump comes in and he plays tough with them, he's going to get them to negotiate a deal which is favorable to Ukraine and to the West, is delusional. It's just not going to happen. Putin is in the driver's seat. It's why he's not going to agree to a ceasefire. Trump is going to come in and probably want to implement a ceasefire right away. Putin would be a fool to agree to implement a ceasefire. He's winning now. Why would he stop the fighting and give Ukraine and the West time to regroup so they can put up a more formidable fight down the road? That would not make good strategic sense, in my opinion.
And speaking of delusional thought, and I know setting it up like that there's any number of people I could be putting up next that fit that blank, but the most probably the most important one is Volodymyr Zelensky, who yesterday made in his daily videos that he makes this rather strange thank you message to his troops in Kursk.
Вдячність нашим воїнам на Курщині. Там потрібна сила, щоб досягти правильних результатів для України, для українців, в дипломатії. Кожен, хто зараз б'ється заради України, реально виборює для України майбутнє. Нам потрібен надійний мир, гарантований.
I'm not sure if you could read all the words. It's kind of small on the bottom of the screen there, but he's thanking his troops in Kursk for helping to achieve the conditions for peace. And then went on to say that, that all of our objectives are certainly going to be accomplished. I mean, almost it's hard to even ask with a straight face what you think about that. But I mean, let's just look at the first part first about the Kursk. Is there anything at all in the Kursk area? And I think maybe what he's talking about here, a lot of people speculate that they seized that ground and they're holding on to it so ferociously with what they have so that they can trade it away for other territory elsewhere. How do you see that?
Well, I think that's probably a reflection of their thinking, that if they can hang on to the Kursk salient, that when they get to the bargaining table, that will be an important bargaining chip. But I don't think they're going to hang on to the Kursk salient over time. I think eventually when the Russians see an appropriate opening, they will shut down that salient completely. They just don't think it's the right time to do that because they have other fish to fry. But when they come to the negotiating table at some point down the road, you're not going to get a genuine peace here because neither the Ukrainians nor the West are going to accept the Russian territorial conquests that we will see at that point in time. And it's hard for me to imagine the Ukrainians and the West accepting Putin's demand that Ukraine has to be a genuinely neutral state and that it cannot be in Ukraine and it cannot even be a de facto member of Ukraine. Can you imagine the West and Ukraine accepting that? I can't. And I can't imagine them accepting all of these territorial conquests that the Russians have already made and the forthcoming ones as well. So I don't see a genuine peace agreement here. I see a frozen conflict with all sorts of potential for that frozen conflict to heat up again and turn into a fight somewhere down the road.
But see, here's one of the things that mitigate against a frozen conflict is that for the Ukraine side to even maintain the lines, they've got to have a lot more people because they're just getting them chewed up in incredible speeds and they're losing territory as it is. So they would have to increase their personnel in order to even get to a freeze point at a static line on the front because right now, of course, they're losing. One other thing that Putin spoke about today, which I think is really important and needs to be discussed, he said that for them to get those additional number of people to even have the possibility of doing that means they're going to have to lower the age of mobilization down to 18 years old. And Putin had this to say about that.
If they reduce the mobilization age, lower the service age, it will not change the situation on the battlefield like it didn't for Hitler's Germany. But it will be one in a series of crimes they commit against their people. It doesn't protect the interests of the Ukrainian people. Such a decision would only protect the decisions of those who give decisions from abroad. That is the only motivation. Young boys will be herded and sent to be slaughtered We saw how they are being caught in the streets like stray dogs and sent to face the bullets.
Do you think that's a good analogy? He's talking about the Volkskriegsgerede of the Germans in the latter stages of the war when it was lost, and they were just throwing whoever they could get, old men and boys, into uniforms. Do you think that's a fair analogy to mobilizing down to 18 years old?
No, in the sense that 18 and 19 and 20 years are different than 12, 13, 14, and 15-year-olds. When I was in the American military and people were getting drafted, I believe the draft age was 19. And there were lots of people who fought in World War II on the American side who were 18 years old. So I think if you brought in 18 and 19-year-olds, that would help somewhat. The problem the Ukrainians face is twofold. One is they're actually, because of birth patterns in Ukraine over time, and this is the past that we're talking about, there are not a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds available at this point in time. And the second, and maybe even more important point, is that Ukraine is in a demographic death spiral independent of this. This is what's happening at the demographic level in Ukraine is catastrophic. And this would just make a horrible situation worse because, as Putin made clear, you'd be bringing large numbers of 18 and 19-year-olds into the meat grinder, and they would die in large numbers. And that would just exacerbate the demographic problem. And it would not improve the situation on the battlefield because there are just not enough 18, 19, and 19-year-olds to make a difference. So it's just hard to see how this is going to solve the problem.
And sticking with the delusional theme for a moment, that I just talked to you about Volodymyr Zelensky's view on that. But it also afflicts a lot in Europe. Here is an expert from the Baltic Defense College, so that tells you a little bit what his motivation may be, on a television show yesterday, saying that basically that they're for all of this additional mobilization, additional stuff from the White House, because really Russia is going to fall apart at any moment.
Most of the EU, I think, is on the right side of this, and certainly there's now talks about between France and Poland about putting EU military personnel in Ukraine. So I think that as days go by, Putin looks weaker and weaker, and he wants to show force as much as possible. So now it just becomes a diplomatic chess game in advance of January 20th.
Explain to me, give me any plausible scenario whereby Putin, from his current position of strength, is going to negotiate something that's going to allow Western troops to act as peacekeepers inside of Ukraine.
He's not. I mean, first of all, we'd be nuts, meaning the West, to put EU troops in Ukraine. That would mean they were in the fight. And these EU troops are NATO troops. And that would mean that NATO was engaged in fighting with Russia. This is what we've been trying to avoid all along. This would be crazy. Putin would never tolerate that. He'd have to be a strategic fool of the first order to consent to allowing the West to put its troops in Ukraine. I just can't imagine that happening.
So then why do otherwise intelligent people in the West, and he's far from the only one, obviously you're hearing that in France and in UK, their leaders are openly talking about it. Why do they talk about something that any rational assessment would say is a dead issue before it even gets started?
It's very hard to say. I mean, I think these people are basically desperate, and they're, clutching at straws. I mean, I don't know what would be a good explanation for why otherwise smart people make such remarkably foolish arguments. I mean, the war in Ukraine is lost. If you're going to make the decision to send NATO troops in and engage the Russians, that's one thing. But if you're not going to send NATO troops in, you're not going to fight World War III against the Russians in Ukraine, then I think you basically have to accept the fact that this war is lost and begin to figure out how to deal with that end game or deal with that outcome. And figure out, what the best strategy is moving forward. But we simply refuse to admit that this one is lost. And everybody's looking for a clever strategy for getting out of the predicament that we're in. And I don't think there's a clever strategy. And I know you don't think there's a clever strategy either. If there excuse me, Danny, if there was a clever strategy, we would have found it and everybody'd be talking about it.
You use that phrase, end game. It's starting to pierce through a little bit to Western thought, because the New York Times a couple of days ago had that very title. I think it was over this weekend. The end game in Ukraine, how the war could come to a close next year. I think they probably should have made that subhead, how the war will come to a close next year. But one of the reasons why I think the New York Times is finally belatedly coming to this recognition is because it's hard to bypass math, basic math. Wall Street Journal last week talked about how that there had been more than 6,000 explosive drones and missiles fired against Ukraine in the month of September, October, and November alone, which at that time was 3 times more than the number it fired over the previous 3 months. So it shows you in every way that Russia's defense industrial capacity continues to expand, and the amount of ordnance that they can just flood across the entire country of Ukraine is growing. And so far in December, that number has continued to escalate and agree. Additionally, that results on the ground, you see that if you can see that in the middle, the lowest number there is 50 square kilometers, the territory Russia took in the month of June. And then you see how it's fired up every single month. It's increasing its rapidity up to 700 square kilometers that were captured in the month of November by itself, which is 4.7 times more than they got in all of the year 2023. So everything you look at, all the math continues to go against the Ukraine side. And it's just hard to understand how anybody in the West ignores the math and thinks that there's some magic way to change it.
I agree. I mean, I think, just to go to the New York Times story that you put up on the screen, I think there's no question the New York Times understands that the end game is coming. But what the New York Times and other outlets and other members of the foreign policy establishment are trying to do is they're trying to make a case for how we can get a truly excellent outcome once there is a final negotiation or some sort of settlement of this conflict. They still labor under the illusion that we can, in effect, win at the negotiating table. But as you and I both know, to win at the negotiating table, you have to win on the battlefield. And it's the Russians who are winning on the battlefield, and therefore they're going to win at the negotiating table. This is not to say they're going to win a decisive victory, that the West and the Ukrainians are going to throw their hands up and concede everything to the Russians. But the Russians are going to win an ugly victory. They're going to end up annexing a huge slice of Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine is going to be left as a dysfunctional rump state.
And toward that end, Trump has been campaigning and said ever since that, or at least in the first part after the campaign, that he would, quote, end the war in a day, et cetera, coming in. Well, in a press conference that just before we came on the air here, he seems to be recognizing a little bit more the closer we get to January 20th, that this is going to be a little harder than he may think.
I think the Middle East will be in a good place. I think actually more difficult is going to be the Russia-Ukraine situation. I see that as more difficult. When you say I don't think they should have allowed missiles to be shot 200 miles into Russia. I think that was a bad thing. And that brought the Koreans in, North Korea, another man I get along with very well. I'm the only one that does.
So how do you read those comments? Do you read it as like starting to get a little bit more realistic?
Yeah, I think that's true, Danny. I hadn't seen those comments until just now. But as you were pointing out, Trump was boasting that he could solve this one even before he moved into the White House. And then he was saying he could solve it immediately after he moved into the White House. But now I think he recognizes that this is a really thorny issue. And I think he realizes that he's going to have to make huge concessions if he wants to get a deal with the Russians, a meaningful deal with the Russians. He's going to have to make huge concessions. And he surely understands that selling that inside the United States will be almost impossible. So he probably understands that he's inheriting a bed of nails here, and there's no way he's going to be able to deal with this terrible situation easily.
What do you suppose might be a good negotiating path for him to put lipstick on a pig, so to speak, so that he can get the thing done? Because I'm sure he wants to turn his efforts to many other domestic issues, and I think this, at the very beginning of his administration, is something he wants to get off the table. How do you think he could sell this to get it over quickly to the U.S.?
Well, he's got to sell it to Putin first, right? I mean, he has to accommodate Putin. As you and I have said, Putin is winning on the battlefield. That means he's in a very strong position at the bargaining table. And Putin's two demands that really matter at this point in time are, number one, that everyone recognize that he has, or Russia has, annexed those 4 oblasts that they almost now control, and the Crimean Peninsula as well. That's point number one. And point number two, Putin insists on a genuinely neutral Ukraine. In other words, a Ukraine that is neither a de facto or de jure member of NATO. And if Trump wants to put this one to bed, he has to accept both of those conditions. And in my opinion, that would be the best deal he could get for Ukraine. Is it a good deal for Ukraine? No. But it's the best deal that the West can get at this point in time, that Ukraine can get at this point in time. The problem is that even if Trump accepts those two demands from Putin, he has to then sell them in the West. And he has to sell them in Ukraine as well, because it's not just the West that's involved in these negotiations, it's Ukraine as well. I hope I'm wrong, but I find it hard to imagine that he could sell such a deal in the West, much less in Ukraine.
Well, and I think that's part of one of the reasons why
conflict.
I think that's one of the reasons why you have folks like Mark Rutte and several of the Keir Starmer and Macron, et cetera, keep on talking about how, whether it's peacekeepers here or no, we're still going to be able to have security guarantees of some kind, because they want to make it hard for Trump to do that. But the consequence is that all of these statements, to include the Biden White House, has been telling everybody that this can be done, that this can be won, that Putin is on his way down. He's weak, like the one I just showed you. And I think that there'll be a shock from a lot of people if they suddenly come up and go, wait a minute, you mean our side can't win? And I think he's going to have to overcome a lot of that.
I agree. But again, I don't think he is going to overcome that. I think the forces that are arrayed against him are mighty powerful. And the Fareed Zakarias of the world are many in number. And if Trump makes any serious concessions to the Russians, there will be hell to pay. And you want to remember, Trump has a lot of issues on his plate, not just foreign policy issues, but domestic issues as well. And there's a limit to how many of those he can deal with all at once. So the more time he spends on Ukraine, the less time he has to deal with the Middle East or to deal with all sorts of other domestic problems that he thinks are enormously important.